the main thing that's kind of driving these questions and uncertainty, I think, for a lot of folks in the industry is like AI, right? And especially shadow AI. What do you see on the ground with like what companies are doing about it, what their concerns are, and maybe just frame what shadow AI is for the audience, I guess, and what do you see in the industry and where do you see it going?
Yeah, so the good news is that the awareness of this issue has gone up considerably in the last year, although it's still, I don't think, exactly where it needs to be. It's funny, like, very often at the beginning of a webinar or a presentation that I'll give, there'll be a question to the audience of kind of rate how much, how widely you're using AI in your organization. And like a year ago, or 18 months ago, like a third of the people or 40% of the people would say we're not using AI, which is, wrong. You're using a lot of AI in your organization. You're just not cognizant of it. Now we typically see that number down into the 15% or something of that nature. So that represents fantastic progress. I think part of the reason is because a lot of the vendors now are they're upgrading their services to add AI at the end of it. So people now know they're cognizantly using AI products. But with the term shadow AI is kind of like the old term shadow IT. It's AI that exists in your organization that might not have been formally brought into the organization by IT or information security and assessed for the level of security, that is inherent within the product. So if you think about, you jump on a meeting, well, look, we're recording on Riverside. Riverside has AI built into it, right? So you can go into Riverside and you can say, create a summary of this podcast, summary transcript of this podcast. You can say, hey, clip 30-second clips where John actually sounded more intelligent than it really is. It'll fail on that one. But this AI is creeping into all of the products we're using, transcription projects. If you're using Grammarly has AI built into it. Project management tools, talent management systems, HR tools, ERP solutions, right? Almost all of them have some level of AI into them. But the reality is that we are not necessarily fully cognizant of it. And as an organization, we often don't have an inventory of all those applications that are using AI. And we don't have understand the use case. We don't know what data is being shared. Perhaps more significantly, we don't know what the risks are associated with it. And perhaps even more significantly, we don't know if the third party that we're using is actually developing that in an appropriate way, right? I mean, AI applications need to be secure, they need to be resilient, they need to be transparent, they need to be non-biased, right? How do we know that they're actually achieving all those frameworks? Because if they don't, according to evolving law, we will be held liable for the issues caused by third-party AI unless we have a comprehensive AI risk management program that we did the appropriate assessment of that vendor.
So if you had to pick something, I'm gonna put you on the spot here, but if you had to implement like one control like tomorrow that reduces shadow AI risk without killing innovation, what would that be?
An acceptable use policy that I don't want to say is heavily enforced, but people honored. If you're going to use an application that has AI, that you're going to put your hand up and say, I'm using this, here's how I'm using it, is it okay? What are the things what risks do I need to be conscious of, and how do we protect ourselves? Because that's at least a starting point. I always like to use the term, drain the swamp, contain the swamp. So that begins the process of containing the swamp. So if in a typical 1,000-person organization, there are probably 200 SaaS applications running. Roughly 63% of those are now currently AI enabled, according to recent studies. So you're talking you have 125 AI use cases ongoing right now. So it's going to take a while to kind of figure out the backlog. So let's contain the swamp. So anything new that's going to happen, let's be cognizant of it. Let's make intelligent decisions. Let's make sure that we're using this application in a way which we benefit from the AI enablement, but it doesn't put us at risk. And then eventually, as you mature your program, we'll kind of go back, risk model the other, we'll inventory and risk model the other 125 and begin to slowly clean up that mess.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. I have a follow-up question. You just kind of got me thinking. There's all these frameworks about okay, well, see what are you using, what does it have access to, what are the risks, and kind of we're using the word AI as this blanket statement, but there's also there's a lot of different kinds of AI. There's third-party APIs, there's self-hosted models, there's stuff you can run in on-site, on-prem, or in the cloud, and there's quite a huge variety of models available today. And if you wanted to do a security risk assessment of a model and seeing how easily can it be prompt injected or told to do something nefarious by some untrusted used third-party input while it's searching something online to do something for you, they're gonna evaluate very differently, right? They're not all going to have the same problems. And I'm just wondering, as like a regulatory framework or compliance framework, how can that be captured or how can that be assessed, I think? Is there any work going on or even conversation about this kind of stuff where you kind of differentiate between, AI and like specific models or specific use cases?
Yeah, you just opened up a giant can of worms that we're not going to get the lid back on in this podcast. Let's break that down a little bit because your thought process is 100% right. AI is a generic term, right? There's AI, old school ML AI, right? Then there's Gen AI, which is a completely different class of AI. And then there's chatbots, and then there's RAG, and there's, CAG, and there's MCP servers, and there's agents, and there's agentic AI, and there's chained agent. And then even within that, right, through the MCP or through a chained agent, we might have connections into backend data stores. We might have API keys into Salesforce and things of that nature. So when we talk about risk, like you were talking about earlier, as you get away from a simple SaaS use case, right? So it's pretty easy to risk model Grammarly if you're using Grammarly. What are you worried about with Grammarly? Well, I'm putting data, it's reading my documents and they're going up into the cloud. But there's a switch in there that says, don't train on my data. And they're ISO 42001 certified. So someone has validated that they're actually honoring that. I can probably turn that on and not worry that much about it, right? So that risk modeling is very trivial. When you risk model or threat model is another term that you hear. When you threat model, I'm building an agentic AI, right? So it has some level of autonomy and it's it's controlling my Gmail and it's reaching into our Salesforce CRM through an API key. But when you start to think about what could go wrong there, it's not in the same universe of risk, right? So that's where the good news about shadow AI is that the risk of most shadow AI is much lower than the risk of more advanced AI systems.
That's
right?
more like tightly integrated where it's given more access, right? Shadow AI is less likely to have access to internal things because it's
exceedingly well said. But that being said, the problem with all this stuff is you can get like a personal knowledge application like Tana or MEM-AI or any of these, right? And they have integrations. So like if you're using, so if you download N8N, which is like an AI automation, it's a workflow automation, but a lot of people are using it now in the AI world. You download that and you're like, okay, well, it connects to like 300 things. And all you really need is to have is credentials or a key, and you can turn as a general purpose user in your organization, someone who has no admin credentials, things they could build a very complex AI. So I have a client it's a technology company. They have a lot of AI tools available. Because all the developers are using Claude or they're using Cursor AI, and they're a very sophisticated organization. And the CEO came forth and said, we all need to be thinking about using AI. We need to be more effective. We need to be more efficient. So the guy in marketing heard that. Now, the guy in marketing has no technical capabilities at all, but I should be using Claude. And he figured out if I could automate this part where I reach out to customers and do X and Y, this would be great, wouldn't it? So he actually downloads Claude Code and he talks to Claude Code, builds an application, gives it the credentials and into his Gmail, gives it an API key to their Salesforce, and some bad stuff happened.
Anything you can talk about or?
No.
Okay.
Right. I can tell you about another client. They're a G Suite user. The person was using either CoWork or Claude Code. I think it was just Claude CoWork. She gave it access into it, and she said, I'm having trouble prioritizing my work. I get way too many emails. Most of them are not relevant to me. And she gave it this really elegant prompt. She said, can you reorganize my mailbox so that, what I need to work on right away is, its answer was to delete the things that it didn't think she needed to pay attention to. And it wiped out, years where she's in the IT department, like, hey, can you restore my mailbox? So yeah, you can get yourself into trouble. And the problem is that people can get themselves into trouble without, they don't need IT, right? The tools that are available to them, unless you're explicitly blocking, unless you're educating your users, people can get themselves in trouble. So yeah, it's a brave new world.